Hi, my name is Karen Miller. Thank you so much for coming. I'm here to talk about my forthcoming book. It's called Managing Racial Equality, Northern Racial Liberalism in Interwar Detroit. In my book, I examine race and politics in Detroit in the 1920s and 30s. And what I'm really interested in is how liberalism begins to become important in American cities. Liberalism starts to become more important politically in cities in the North over the course of the 20th century. At the same time that African American activists are really beginning to make bigger and more successful political claims to equality, white liberals are embracing those claims of equality, but they're rejecting the notion that the city needs to be reconfigured in order to accommodate and produce new sorts of equality. So what I show and what I argue is that white liberals and African Americans broker a language of racial equality in Detroit in the 1920s and 30s that allows for white liberals to position themselves aside African Americans, but simultaneously and somewhat cynically build an interracial city that is based on segregation and racial inequality. And so I'm really interested in how that works. My claim is that this really starts in the United States, in northern cities. The story that we have of race in America is a story about slavery. So people, when they talk about racism and its emergence and its uses today, they often refer back to this history of slavery. What I argue in my book is that slavery actually doesn't explain contemporary racial formations in the way that we want it to. What we need to focus on is the North. So that image of slavery that I just showed you is a rural economy, a plantation economy, perhaps a cotton economy. I'm arguing that race takes on different meanings in a northern industrial economy, and that it's those kinds of meanings that shape contemporary discourse about race and racial inequality. So we have this paradox today. What's that paradox? The paradox is that all Americans ostensibly believe in racial equality. At the same time, we have a country that is quite neatly organized along the lines of racial inequality. What is that paradox? Where does it come from? And how does it continue to animate politics? Like I said, I'm interested in the emerging power of white liberals in the American North. These are a couple of figures who I'm interested in. This is Josephine Goman. She's the head of the City Planning Commission in the 1930s. She's there with Eleanor Roosevelt, who you all may have heard of. She was the wife of Franklin Roosevelt. This over here is Frank Murphy. He was the mayor of Detroit through the early 1930s. He's actually most famous as a Supreme Court justice. He takes on that role in the 1940s. And he's most famous for dissenting in the Korematsu case. That was the Japanese internment case. So this is somebody who built his career on racial liberalism. Both of these white figures are members of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Both of them see themselves and their commitment to racial equality as actually central to their politics. So then what happens? Why do we end up with the kind of segregated cities that we have if we see white leaders embracing equality in the kinds of ways that we do in the 1930s? So I'm going to look at a case study. It's the last chapter of my book, and the last chapter of my book examines the public housing program in Detroit in the 1930s. And what is that public housing program about, and how do African Americans fit into it in ways that are conflicted and, again, somewhat cynical? White leaders such as Murphy and Goman make promises to African Americans and say, what we're going to do is we're going to tear down the slum area and we're going to improve your living. This is an image of houses that are slotted for demolition. Again, this image is taken by a photographer who's sympathetic to the demolition project. But the demolition project itself is a little bit complicated. So we're going to tear down dilapidated housing, and we're going to offer you beautiful new housing. So this is the project that does end up getting built. It's the Brewster Homes. Diana Ross grew up there, if you guys have heard of her. And it really is better housing. Here we have an African-American family standing in front of it. This is what the housing looks like on the inside. People have access now. They have electric stoves. They hadn't previously. Running water. Those houses that I showed you previously don't have running water. They don't have electricity. Folks were using outhouses in Detroit in the 1930s, not uncommon for working class folks in the United States. But there's a problem with this housing project, and the problem is that it's segregated. So here we have the liberal promise of resources to African Americans, but that promise comes with the evolution of a segregated city. And that's what I'm just going to check my time. Okay, the evolution of a segregated city. At the same time that the Brewster homes are being built, which I was just talking about a minute ago, the city is building the Parkside homes, an exclusively white housing project on the other side of the city. The way these projects function is different. For African Americans, white leaders decide what we're going to do is tear down the slum area in the city. So here we see the site, here we see the site of the Brewster homes. This is a map that shows us the density of African Americans in the city of Detroit. Detroit leaders are saying what we need to do is get poverty out of the middle of the city. We need to rebuild this area. And again, this is something that African Americans are very enthusiastic about. But low-income housing, the kinds of resources that are being given to African Americans are linked to maintaining segregation. So for a black city, for a black public housing project, they're going to tear down a slum area and rebuild right on that area. That's going to cause some problems, and you're going to see what those problems are in a minute. At the same time, the site of the white homes is right here. It turns out that this area is not very well developed yet. So there are no people who live there. There's no slum clearance associated with it. If you're white and you want to move into those projects, you apply to get into them. You don't have to actually leave your current home, be homeless for a few years, try to figure out what to do. But that's not the story for African Americans. Like I said, African Americans are supportive of this program because of the kinds of resources that they're going to be able to access from the state. And that's really important. This is a complicated story, not a story of strict segregation and strict, shall we say, refusal of resources to African Americans. It's one where African Americans are getting resources, but as second-class citizens and as segregated northern citizens. This is Eleanor Roosevelt. She was in Detroit, that first picture. She was in Detroit in 1935 to open the demolition ceremony where they're going to start tearing down houses in the slum district. As you see, African Americans are there. They're very enthusiastic about it, dressed up very well. Here is Geraldine Walker. She's a young girl who is part of a dance troupe that performed for Mrs. Roosevelt and hands her a marigold as part of this ceremony. But then what's really happening? So what we see is black political support for this project, but Mrs. Rosa Lee Jackson, I think, is a really good indication of the negative effects of this program and of the ways that segregation produces problems for African Americans that simply don't have to happen and that are not happening for white Detroiters at the same time who are benefiting from a similar kind of program. This is Mrs. Rosa Lee Jackson. She was highlighted in the Detroit News because she is the first resident whose house will be cleared. She doesn't own the house, she rents it. She rents it for about $12 a week. That's actually very high rent. The slum area that I just showed you has has rents that look like the rents in middle-class districts where folks are getting much bigger housing and much better services, and that's because of segregation. African Americans are subjected to higher rents in the city. Mrs. Rosa Lee Jackson moves out of her home. She had lived there alone with her cat and her dog, and she didn't want to move. When she was contacted, she was very frustrated and angry about it, but her landlord owned the home and he agreed to the project. These are folks moving her out of her house. And so part of what happens is that Mrs. Rosa Lee Jackson is, for me, she helps us to trouble this story about African Americans receiving resources, and that must be good. Because Mrs. Rosa Lee Jackson herself doesn't have access to the housing project that's going to be built in the neighborhood where she was living. In order to have access to that housing, you need to be a family you need to be married, you need to have kids, and you actually also need to make a little bit more money. Rents in the project that are built on the cleared area end up being higher than the rents that had been there at the time. The other problem with the clearance is that it ends up clearing away Hastings Street. Hastings Street at the time was a very vibrant African-American business district. And this, again, is a story that you hear in all kinds of northern cities, that urban renewal projects clear away African-American districts, even those black districts that are absolutely thriving. So again, in the beginning of the talk, I showed you the images of black housing and the image of possibility that white liberals were casting when they talked about this project. But when you look more closely, you start to see these problems. One, you see people like Mrs. Rosa Lee Jackson who aren't going to have access to that new resource. And secondly, you see Hastings Street, which is really a quite vibrant district. Hastings Street is not a district that has a lot of blight. It's a district where black-owned businesses really thrive. And that's going to hurt the African-American community in Detroit. Like I said, folks are excited about the Brewster homes. So again, I want to complicate this story. It's not one way or the other, but it's shaped by segregation. Okay. And wait, let me see. Sorry. Oh, perfect. And again, the claim that I'm making here is that public housing is good, but the way that it gets enacted ends up producing the sorts of segregation that we see in the city. And just as a closing, I want to point to how this works, and that segregation ends up being linked to African Americans having less access to sort of economic mobility. So this is a map, this is a contemporary map that shows the continuity of the sorts of segregation that gets built even by liberals in Detroit during this time. This is Detroit. As you see, this is a map of racial segregation in Detroit. Areas that are predominantly African American are blue, areas that are white are red, and areas that are green are Asian. There's a small Asian community right here in Hamtramck. The blue area, this is 8 Mile Road. So for those of you who've heard of 8 Mile, there was a movie made about it. That separates the city from the suburbs. There is some black migration into the northwest suburbs, but the majority of African Americans in the region are in Detroit, which, as you see here, is a much poorer city than these surrounding neighborhoods. So we see the ways that segregation, the segregation that gets established, this kind of northern form of segregation that's discrete, it's not built on the kinds of overt expressions of segregation, overt expressions of racism that we see in the South, that ends up having an incredibly, incredibly important effect on the urban geography that we see today. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.